All right, guys, I'm gonna do this most of the same ways we did last year. Just kind of cover what everybody wants to know, and then cover anything I think you ought to know outside of that. Basically been building carburetors for 30 plus years now. Running methanol for most of that myself. And the last 5 or 6 years building for whoever wants them. Built for friends for 25 of those 30 years. So, just, if you want, we can just kind of start off with getting you guys up to what you want to know. So if anybody has particular questions on carburetors or methanol, either one, anything in specific anybody wants covered, let me know.
How hard is it to convert a Rochester G2?
It's not necessarily hard. The biggest problem right now is the parts, the accelerator, the rubber for the accelerator pump. They were a black rubber forever and worked fantastic with the methanol. They converted most all the kits now to like a blue rubber that's supposed to be more ethanol friendly, and it works fine on the 85 setups because I do a lot of those for guys too. But for whatever reason, when you drop that same little blue rubber in a cup of methanol, it just instantly doubles in size, and it does basically the same thing in the carburetor. It'll run great for a day or two, and then you go to run for the next time, and it doesn't have an accelerator pump. It just pops the ring off right in the pump. Do you have a pump back here? No. Basics, carburetor wise, 90% of the questions that I field as far as day in and day out setup is guys want to know why their car is stalling on impact, or right after they hit, they go to go again and it's stalling out. There's a few different reasons for that. The number one thing that people get tripped up on the most is setting the float levels. In the race car world, you set your float level by, you want it to just barely be trickling out the sight glass hole if it has a plug, or if it has a glass, you want it to be basically in the bottom of the glass, just sitting there idling. In the derby world, if you set it that high, it will commonly slosh over and stall on hitting, especially if you get hit real hard on the side, it'll slosh and stall. I set everybody, that I set up for, I set them so that sitting there, whether it's electric pump just on, not running, or I prefer to set them idling, to have to actually shake the car a little bit to get it to trickle out, or to see it in the sight glass. That's what I've found to work the best for not over fueling, especially on impact. Another issue, a lot of guys get, either something you've had for a long time, or you buy it right out of the box and bolt on. Holley doesn't set any of the air idle mixture screws anymore. They used to baseline set them. They used to baseline set the floats. They don't do either anymore. So you have to set it up. Like 1 1/4 turns out on gas is a good starting point. 1 1/2 to 1 3/4 turns on methanol is a good starting point. The absolute best way is if you have a vacuum gauge, to go on your full-time vacuum and just keep vacuuming your 4-corner or 2-corner, which if you're running 2 barrels, only got 2. Some 4 barrels only have 2. But either way, you want to just bring them out and watch your vacuum climb wherever you find maximum vacuum. There again, in the racing world, they will tell you that, or most of the street, you find your primary vacuum and then you go back in a 1/4 turn. In the derby world, I've found it actually works out better if you don't go back in that 1/4 turn. It richens the idle circuits up a little bit, and it makes it blend in with the transition circuits better. A lot of stalling, if you hit, go in reverse and stab it to go back and it wants to cut out and stall on you, a lot of times that's trying to go from the idle circuit to the transition circuit, and it's just not making the transfer. Because of the way that we run our cars most of the time, a lot of guys like to run their idle high. That'll also make the transition circuit lean by a factor that it's always open. I don't know if that makes sense saying that, but on the bottom of the butterflies, there's a transfer slot. And when you set your idle, you're opening that butterfly. Well, the farther you open that butterfly, the more transition slot you show. So then you're already in the transition. So when you hit that throttle, it's stumbling because it doesn't have the transition slot to carry it from idle to like 2,500 RPMs where the carburetor actually picks up and runs through the primary side of the carburetor. So if you've got your air idle screws set rich enough, you can usually set your idle screw low enough that you have the full transition circuit to get through. And though in theory it sounds backwards that your car's going to be less likely to die idle down, if it's idling smooth on the idle circuits, it will transition smoother and way less likely to die. Guys once in a while ask me about jetting, but that's kind of an altogether different game. Guys are like, oh, my car, it's running rich, so I keep jetting it down. It's not changing. That's because your primary jet doesn't control the idle circuit. And most guys think of their car running rich, sitting there running rich, it's jetting, and it's not. It's the idle circuitry. And without a lot of time doing it or a dyno to do it with, that's a hard base to cover just because you can adjust it with your, like carburetors with adjustable air bleeds on the top like this. You can adjust your air that way, or you can adjust the actual idle circuit inside the metering block. Most of the time, that stuff's pretty close. So we're okay there. Carburetor wise and drivability wise, you guys have any questions, anybody? Nope. Easy group.
I've seen holes like drilled in a butterfly with an idle. Is that what is that actually for?
The larger camshaft, I shouldn't say larger, that's an improper term. The more overlap your camshaft has, the choppier it idles, the more that hole will commonly increase for a smoother, it's still choppy idle, but the same consistent idle. Sometimes if you have one that, no matter what you do with the air idle screws, you stab it and let off, it'll still die. You can enlarge the hole in the butterfly a little bit, like a thousandths or 2,000ths bigger than what it is, and put it back on, and it'll sit there idle fine, stab it, and it'll go right back idle. And what that also goes back to your transition circuit. What that hole is doing is allowing you to close your idle down, so that it's running on the idle circuit, not the transition circuit. Carburetors idle like shit on the transition circuit. They don't have any actual control. Your transition slot's a 1/4 inch long, so it's sitting there. A lot of fuel, little air, a lot of air, little fuel, a lot of back and forth, just by the pulse of the engine. Mm-hmm. So that's somewhat out there. What was your question?
What's your go-to carburetor that you recommend for folks?
Loaded question.
Yep, I knew it was.
Would you call me and say, hey, my kid's got a youth car, he's running a bone stock 350 Vortex that we pulled out of a truck, freshened up. I'm gonna tell you your best bet's a Rochester 2G. It's the most consistent running at the most angles carburetor that you're gonna bolt on if it's right. As you up the cubic inches, it does get to a point where the 2-barrel Hollies get more adjustability on gas. Still takes, in my opinion, up to a 383 on a 500 CFM 2G will probably perform as well as anything. Now, the more you start to change your heads and your camshaft and air in, air out, and that sort of thing, then you can get more use out of the adjustability of the Holly. With the metering block, gives you a lot more room to play on the Holly, as far as more idle, less idle, so on and so forth. On methanol, your methanol is going to use 1.8 times the fuel that you use on gasoline. basically a 355, 355 small block with a Rochester 2G on methanol always worked fine. I ran them for years. I have several guys that are still running them. Get to the bigger stuff, you get your 383s and your 400s, 421s, a lot of guys are running. You need a little bit more adjustability to really curb that, because most guys aren't running a 421 cubic inch small block with a RV cam, you know.
Yeah.
So you need the adjustability of the Holly to get it to perform from idle to wide open, which, you know, is something that we in the Derby world have to contend with that most other forms of racing don't. Most guys, if it idle long enough for the tree to go green, or if it idle long enough for the, you know, guy to throw the green flag in the flag stand and they can go wide open, that's all they care. And Derby world, we've got to be able to idle, half throttle, sandbag for 2 hours and 15 minutes, drive wide open for 5 minutes at the end, you know, whatever, you know, you need it to work all the way through, and especially, you know, guys that are running bigger engines. Like the Hollies better just because I can give them that range of, I want to be able to drive it around like it's my daily driver for 2 hours until there's 3 cars left, and then I want to be able to drive it like it's a race car for 10 minutes. Mm-hmm. And I can do that a lot more with the adjustability of the Holly than I can with 2G. Any other specific questions? On the methanol side of things, thing I wanted to cover this year, guys are asking, there's a lot more promoters that are asking safety questions. I know most everybody in the room is driver, not promoter, but it's, you know, you still need to know what you're talking about if you want to do it. As far as, you know, going to your local fair board and saying, you know, hey, I'm running methanol, you know, some fair boards are like, oh my God, I don't know what to do with that. It's the exact same fire to put out as if you're on gas. Their fire extinguisher that puts your fuel tank leaking in the back of your car out on gas will put the same fire out on methanol. It's less likely to be on fire on methanol. That's discussion for another day. People will say, well, is it safe for my wife? Is it safe for my kid? This, that, and everything. Like I said last night at the promoter summit, you're far more likely to be burned by a transmission fire than you are a methanol fire. I've been running it for going on 30 years now, and I've never yet had a fire inside the car. Now, part of that's because the fuel system's right front and back, but it's also because it's not an overly volatile system. There's a lot of myths about it, but it's as stable or more stable in our profession than what everybody's used to. Last thing I probably want to cover as far as the methanol goes for you guys is just, you know, like I said before, it's super important to keep the system clean. And the reason I brought this particular carburetor with today to show is if you're running a 4-barrel setup on methanol, and we tell everybody run until they run out of fuel, and then put the fuel line in gas and run fuel through the system, light it, let it have a little bit of gas through it, and it'll store. Something that wasn't necessarily covered was the 4-barrel side of that. And I've had 4 or 5 in the last 6 months that had issues with, well, my carburetor still runs fine after I stored it, but if I'm really getting in it, it's popping and cracking and carrying on. And the reason that is because though they flushed it, they only flushed out the front half of the carburetor, because when they let it run and idle until it died, it didn't use all the fuel out of the back of the carburetor. If you're using a 4-barrel carburetor and you're going to run it to store it, once it gets down, you'll notice it'll start to stumble like it's getting lean. Once it starts to stumble a little bit, just crack the back butterflies open a little bit, bring the idle back up, and make it use the fuel out of the back. And then run the gas into it just like you did. Pump the accelerator 3 or 4 good times so you get gasoline through the, through the accelerator pump, through the nozzles, the discharge nozzles, everything, so that it doesn't have methanol anywhere within the carburetor when you're storing it. I fire mine, run them for a minute or so, it blows black smoke, and runs super rich, but you know it's clean that way. And then when you get ready to fire it back up again, all you gotta do is just dehook your tank and fire it. It'll fire on the gas, run crappy. Once it picks some methanol up, it'll smooth out and run the way you're used to. Any questions on that?
I guess one topic that came up in the last discussion was why would somebody choose E85 over methanol or vice versa?
Methanol will run about 35% cooler than what E85 will. E85 is more readily available in areas where you don't have a local racetrack or a local speed shop to go buy your fuel from. There are still, most places somewhere within a 50-mile circle, you've got a gas station you can go buy E85 at. Now, of course, there's performance E85 that you can buy through the speed shops. But, you know, availability is a big thing that, you know, a lot of guys go with E85. It was thought for a long time that, you know, I'm gonna run E85 because the maintenance is lower. It's really not. It won't sit in your system without having problems any longer than what methanol will. If you keep your radiator, E85 will run the whole time at 180 degrees. If you keep your radiator, you'll have to run really hard on methanol to get it to 180 degrees. But if you bust a radiator, it's not very long at all before you're just as hot on E85 as what you would be on gas. The difference just isn't that much in the actual combustion chamber of the fuel. On methanol, it'll run until you run out of methanol or the bearings melt clean out of the crankshaft. The top end's not going to seize up. I've ran a couple hours at a time. I ran an hour and 45 minutes without a drop of water, and it did finally seize the bottom end up, but the top of the intake was still cold.
So it keeps the pistons and everything lubricated more than gas?
That's a good question. With methanol, we run a top cylinder lube, and that helps lubricate the whole top end, the valve stems, the pistons, everything. But methanol keeps the piston far cooler because of the detonation difference between the methanol and the gasoline. Guys ask, well, do I have to run more compression? No. You can run more compression. It will allow more compression, but you don't have to run it. Basically, and that's a really good measuring point, because from the pistons up, everything's going to stay cool. You're still going to need an oil cooler to keep your cam bearings from melting out and your main bearings from melting out and everything else, because you're still building that temperature down there. The friction on the cam or the crankshaft and camshaft and lifters and all that doesn't change it. It just that's still building the same heat it built before.
Just the temperature in the combustion chamber is cooler.
Far cooler. In fact, my LS's with the aluminum heads, I can run an hour and a half and shut it off, and the heads aren't much warmer than the intake is, because it's just the whole charge on the top end is much cooler. That's the same reason we started playing a lot with the aluminum heads on the small blocks too.
What about the shelf life of alcohol and methanol?
Sealed up, it'll keep for a couple seasons real easy. Biggest thing with methanol is just don't leave it open to air. The evaporation rate of methanol is astronomical. That's why the intakes, that's why an intake will actually frost up in a 2-hour feature. It's the actual evaporation rate of the fuel inside the chamber that causes it to do that. So if you're, if it's in a drum, I've had a drum of fuel for 2.5 seasons, no trouble. In my tank, I don't have any issues with it. It won't keep more than a couple weeks in the line. Like from the tank to the carburetor, 10 days is pretty much
A
top.
large amount of it will last for a while.
Biggest thing is it's mostly because it's closed up. Once it's going through the system, your fuel pump has a vent in it that lets it work. It's got to be able to pull air to push fuel. Well, that same vent allows air to get into your fuel system. So myself, I tell guys how to drain them and how to, do everything, but I just run mine. I run it once every week, 10 days tops, and I don't have to worry about flushing the carburetor, flushing the lines, all that. I just keeps my neighbors happy with me, and I prefer to just run it once a week or so.
It's motivating to hear it too, right?
Right. That, testing 2 to 10 carburetors a day, shit runs a lot.
What's the shelf life on race gas? Like, there are guys getting rid of gas after the end of the year.
Honestly, Rick, I can't 100% speak to that. I know most guys do try to push their fuel off at the end of each season, what they have left. I have to assume there's something to that.
Yeah.
But, I mean, I don't honestly know because I've done a lot with our race car stuff on 110 and whatnot, but at the same thing, we never really had masses of fuel to store for any period of time.
I stored a 110 from one summer to the next summer in a sealed drum, no issues. But that was only 1 year.
Right. And I think, honestly, regardless of what you're talking about, the sealed drum is the most important part. A lot of guys, well, I had it in my race jug in the trailer, and it turned colors. It absolutely will. I don't care whether you're talking about 110 or methanol. If you put a 5-gallon jug in your trailer and your trailer's 115 to 150 degrees all day long for a week, when you pull it out, it's not gonna smell very good. It's not gonna look very good. I don't store week to week. If I take fuel to a show in a jug, after the show I pour it back into the drum and close the drum up. I think that's just the safest bet in storage. Anybody else have anything? All right, guys. Well, I won't keep you any longer, but I'm always available if you have any questions. Give me a holler.